Hello. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm very excited to have a wonderful cast of artists here to discuss some art with tonight. So what are you viewing at the moment? It's the Art Now Fine Art Fair 2021. This is the panel entitled Show and Tell, Connecting with Art, sponsored by Sandra Jackson, CPA Professional Corp. So welcome to this discussion. And before we begin, I'd like to just make an acknowledgement to this land and the peoples of this land on which we are now gathering, albeit virtually. So I'd like to just take a moment to recognize that we are in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 land, which encompasses the traditional territories of the Cree, Dakota, Dene, Lakota, Nakota, and Sato people, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis. So thank you for that. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Kimberley Fyfe. I'm the former co-owner of Slate Fine Art Gallery here in Regina, and also the former vice president of SAS Galleries, who puts on this amazing fair every year. And thank you so much for tuning in to be part of this event. I love this format. I love the accessibility of it and the opportunity to talk in a real public forum about art in a wonderful sharing way. And I love the connections that we've made so far with this event. Last night was just wonderful. That kickoff, looking and dissecting all the artwork that we went through with Jessie and Zoe was fantastic. So I hope you enjoy tonight's session as much as you did last night. There will be an opportunity to ask questions of the panel. So you all should have a chat box somewhere on your Zoom screen. Type your questions in there and we'll get to them as we can. But please note, due to time constraints, we might not be able to ask everyone's questions, but we'll definitely do our best to address them. So we're going to begin with our panelists. I'll just do a quick little intro, say a few words. They can say a few words if they so wish, and then we'll get on with their questions about connecting with art. So the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Marie Lanew. Marie is a Saskatoon-based artist and a recipient of Saskatchewan Art Boards and Canada Council grants. She has exhibited provincially, nationally, and internationally, and has experiences, residencies, and workshops in Belgium at the Banff School of Fine Arts and the Emma Lake Artist Workshops. And in 2010, Lanew opened an artist studio space at 330 Avenue G South in Saskatoon, which by 2012 included her 330G, an independent self-curated project space that she invites local and national and international artists to. And I'm sure we'll get Marie to talk about that a little bit more later. It's a very exciting space. So her most recent exhibitions include All In at New Zones Gallery of Contemporary Art in Calgary, The Architecture of Color at the College Art Galleries, University of Saskatchewan. And also in 2019 at the Mackenzie Art Gallery, Marie helped launch their first online project that was entitled Marie Lanew Blue Sky. And that was done in conjunction with her project space. Marie, 330G. I don't know why I have a problem with that address. My apologies, Marie. Do people often get that number wrong? Just me. I'll get you to unmute your mic so we can hear your beautiful voice.
It's the address of the building, so 330 Avenue G, right? So
330. 330. Yeah. I want to read the 33 first. Okay, 330G. I'll remember it now on. And so will our audience.
Great.
So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. You know, you've covered a lot of ground. You know, I've worked in Saskatchewan for many, many years. And my husband and I have been collectors since we got together, actually, which is so many years ago, I don't even want to go there. And our house is full of work that we live with. And because we have so much, we tend to change it around as well. And it is simply something that has interested both of us. And for me in particular, being an artist, I also have an interest in supporting my peers and colleagues and emerging artists through the work that I acquire and trade. And so that's a really important component of my interest. And also the project space that I have at 330G enables me to connect with artists both here and away. And that's also facilitated an opportunity to enlarge my collection. And I'm afraid I'm quite, I have a large appetite, let's put it that way, to collect.
That's because there's so many great,
So,
yeah, it's because there's
anyway,
so many
thank
great
you very
artists.
much for inviting me to be part of the panel.
Thanks so much for being here. And I understand what you're saying. There's a lot of great artists, especially in Saskatchewan. You can just really develop a beautiful collection just from being mindful of where you're collecting from, which is great. Thanks, Marie. Thanks for joining us tonight. I look forward to speaking with you more very soon. So now I'd like to introduce Tarah Hogue. Hi, Tarah. Thanks for being here tonight. So Tarah is a curator, a writer, and a cultural worker living in Treaty 6 Territory, Saskatchewan. She is a curator of Indigenous art at Remy Modern, where she recently co-curated the group exhibition An Apology, Uphill, a Ritual, a Resistance, which is absolutely beautiful. Congratulations on that beautiful show. Tarah is the former Senior Curatorial Fellow of Indigenous Art at the Vancouver Art Gallery. She was there from 2017 to 2020 in that position, and she is currently the co-chair of the board of directors for the Indigenous Curatorial Collective. She's also a citizen of the Métis Nation, as well as being of settler ancestry. Welcome, Tarah. We're really excited to have you on here this evening.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I was excited to get the invitation for this panel because it's only really been since moving to Saskatoon, like pretty much exactly 1 year ago, that I have been able to start living with some of the artwork that I have. I lived in Vancouver for 13 years, and I lived in my husband's screen printing shop, which is like warehouse space. And I also lived in a 13-foot bowler trailer. So I had one tiny Inuit sculpture of a muskox that traveled with me. So
and
since
now,
coming here,
yeah, now you have walls, right?
Yes,
now you have
exactly.
walls, yeah.
So I've been like framing a piece every couple of months, and it's meant that I've been able to start pulling things out of the file folder that, you know, I haven't seen in sometimes years. Yeah. So
that's
now,
wonderful.
and now I get to talk about it and people will listen. So
absolutely. Yeah. I'm excited to have you share your collection in a bit. Thank you, Tarah, and thanks so much for being here. So now our last, and you know, I save the best for last. Our last panelist is Yann Martel, Saskatchewan writer, who I'm sure you all have heard of before. He's an author of a collection of short stories, volumes of letters to former Prime Minister Harper about books, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and 4 novels, most notably Life of Pi. And that's a whole other Zoom meeting that we'll have all about that book. So his next novel, which is inspired by the Trojan War, a topic close to my heart, this is very exciting. It will be called The Son of Nobody. So I look forward to reading that piece when it comes out. And Yann currently lives in Saskatoon. Thanks for joining us, Yann.
It's a pleasure, Kimberley. It's great being on this panel. I am the outsider in the sense that I'm not a practicing visual artist or a curator. I'm the other end of the equation. I'm the one who loves visual arts. For the longest time, I had no visual art of my own because I traveled so much. And I generally like being very light. So that's why I love public art. I love public galleries, museums. I love public libraries because then you can experience art with other people without having it. Owning it yourself. But however, I've been living now for 20 years in Saskatchewan, and I have 4 children, so I'm necessarily rooted to a spot, and it's nice to have a house that in some ways beautiful. You can't just have blank walls. And so I've started acquiring art recently and living with it in a very meaningful way, which I think we'll discuss as the panel starts up.
Absolutely, we will.
Pleasure being here. Yeah,
thank you again. Thank you. I think it's going to be a really great evening. So just to set the stage a little bit, I'm just going to kind of read for a moment the descriptor of this panel session so we can all kind of get an idea of what it is we're trying to achieve in our conversations this evening, or at least that's what we're hoping to achieve. You never know where things are going to go. The most exciting thing, though, is we are going to talk a lot about connecting with art and how we do that on personal levels, on physical levels. So the intro that we have written to this panel discussion says, the way we experience a piece of art is difficult to translate to language, but this panel will attempt to put into words the connections that people have with art they love. In simple terms, visual art is an arrangement of materials shaped by information that an artist takes from our big, busy world. What is it about these objects and all the forms they can take that resonates with us? Art opens our understanding of things unknown and expands our outlook on the way they live. In this discussion, we will share stories of artworks that have nourished us. We will describe how those experiences with art in our lives give us beauty and solace and memory, and also offer opportunities to form connections within ourselves and with others. So I want to start, my first question is actually going to be for Marie. I'm going to ask all of the panelists the same questions, but I want to start with Marie and talk about the process of connecting with art. So think about how you feel when art begins to capture you, when it captures your attention. There's always something when you're in a museum, a gallery, or even on the street. I love street art, something that'll make you look twice and grab your eye. And from that moment, once we have our attention gathered, we go on to dissect that artwork and develop a final reaction to it. So Marie, I want to directly wrap that up into a question by saying, what can you say about those moments where you've had art capture your attention, whether it be, like I said, on the street, anywhere? You can take us back, not with one specific piece, but just how you feel in that moment when art captures your attention.
When it captures my attention, I want it, you know, if it's within the realm of possibility. And I'm a very intense looker. And actually, I do have an example. I think it's a really perfect example to share, because it was a piece of work that I saw at a show actually in Saskatoon at a BAM show. BAM was an artist collective, and what happened was artists from Regina, emerging artists from Regina, were paired with emerging artists from Saskatoon. And we don't often have exhibitions where Regina and Saskatoon artists overlap, and certainly in the visual arts. And this was just a wonderful opportunity to see all of these kids together. And a lot of the kids from Regina, I was absolutely not familiar with. So there was a whole bunch of work, and there was one piece that absolutely drove me crazy with excitement. And this is it, right here. It's a small concrete piece with a soldier immersed in concrete, his legs still move, by a young artist by the name of Simon Few. Simon, I think, is just this outstanding artist. He just completed an MFA at the U of T, and he'll be staying in Toronto. I'm sorry he's left Saskatchewan, but it was a moment of simply looking at this piece, and for whatever reason, it is a piece of concrete with a little toy soldier immersed in the concrete. I'm an abstract painter. Why would this grab me? It simply did. And I don't ask questions at that point. I'm simply interested in the piece and how it's grabbed my attention. And I ultimately bought this piece, and it turned out that it was the very first piece he'd ever sold to a collector. And so that made the experience even more momentous for me, right? Supporting a young artist, which is a really important part of my interest, a young emerging artist, a young emerging Saskatchewan artist. And, you know, there are moments like that where you don't need to verbalize what it is that captivated you. You were simply drawn to it in an absolutely compelling way. And that's what it was that prompted me to move forward. And I bought it right away. There was just no hesitation. It was absolutely something I needed to have. And often what happens is once, or for me anyway, sometimes you're captivated by something, and it's only after you have it in your possession maybe that you really start to understand and dissect why, in fact, that piece was something that really captivated your attention and your imagination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I
know-
find that you're right. The longer you live with things, the more you get to understand them, and perhaps to get to understand yourself and why you chose that piece. But
And
just
there-
going back to artwork capturing your attention, like you did show us that piece in particular. What was it about that piece? Was it the uncanniness of what you saw being so different? Was it color based? Like what made you just kind of take a double take at that
the mystery of
one? Mystery.
my
right?
reaction and my, visceral reaction to it was what prompted me. I mean, that was one specific piece. There are other pieces, let's say, that I'm interested in because I'm a painter, and there is a particular aspect about color production in a work that absolutely grabs my attention. And I'll speak to that when we get to my slides and one of the pieces that I chose to reproduce here. It was absolutely because of the methodology that this artist used to create color. I'd never heard of or seen this before in my life. And it was like, oh my God, I wish it was me who had that idea. And I bought that piece right away because the ingenuity behind the idea of creating color the way he did was so fantastic. So I just had to have it. And also support this guy's practice, in the process.
Absolutely. So I want to move over to Yann and ask the same question about capturing artwork. How, in the artwork that you've purchased, or even your times in museums and galleries, what do you find, how a piece attracts your attention out of the corner of your eye? Like Marie touched on the unusual composition or on color. It could be specific things like that. I find for myself, sometimes it's just almost a sense of like that's a piece I need to look at and not really know why, but you're kind of compelled to go over there. Have you experienced anything, Yann, where you have had that moment where something just captured your attention, and what was that moment like for you?
Yeah, I've had that repeatedly. I'll tell the history of my relationship with visual arts is that I was one of those kids who was dragged to art galleries and museums by my parents when I was a kid.
And look how you turned out.
Yeah, my parents are mainly, my father's a writer too. He won the Governor General's for French language poetry.
Fantastic.
They're both, so reading was a big part of the family, but my parents also would drag my brother and me to art galleries. They were diplomats, so we lived in several countries around the world. And that was just a part of the way they lived. They dragged us to art galleries. And I remember as a little kid, whereas you can select books that interest you, that address you as a child, you go to a national gallery, there's no component that's necessarily aimed at children. Yes, there's the little corner where children can play, but in terms of the artwork, it's very much an adult thing. So I very clearly remember being not quite as bad as when my grandmother used to very occasionally drag me to a Catholic mass where I'd be so bored I'd nearly scream. But I remember finding it kind of boring. It was just pictures on the wall. And I was thinking, this is kind of dumb. I'm like, okay, there's a painting of some cows. Didn't really impress me. But they dragged me for years and years in France, in Mexico. They dragged me to art galleries. And suddenly at university, I said, wow, I love art. I want to go to museums. And now whenever I travel, I go to art galleries constantly. So a couple of years ago, I toured Australia with my last novel. And in every city I went to these art galleries. Australia has wonderful art galleries because there's this thing called the Australian cringe, where Australians were embarrassed over being this hick colonial society, far away from everything. They're just a bunch of hicks with kangaroos. And so these Australian millionaires in the early 20th century went on a buying spree. And so there's some phenomenal art museums in Australia. So every single city I was in, I would nourish myself by going to these art galleries. And I do that all the time now. Whenever I travel, one of the things that I do for sure is go to an art gallery. And the reason I like it now is just like writing, it's an attempt to understand reality. We're here on this planet for a few decades. What does it all mean? And we can access meaning in many different ways. I go through it words and stories, musicians through music, and visual artists do it in this like completely crazy rule-less, no rules kind of way. And I find that thrilling because of course I'm quite familiar now with the language of words. But the language of visual arts I find endlessly exciting because it seems to have no rules. And yet it's sometimes it doesn't work for you, and that's totally fine. There's some books that people don't like, even if they're supposed to be great books. You don't like them, you're entitled to your own reaction. Same thing with the visual arts. There's some things that really speak to you, and then some things that don't. But when it speaks to you, like all art, when it hits home, it really hits home. And it has a transformative effect, and it really stays with you, it changes you. So I don't know why I'm mentioning Australia, but there's this wonderful Australian painter named Sidney Nolan, who's really a great artist, a world-class artist. But I really discovered him mostly when I went to Australia and discovered this man who really captured the Australian reality. So I've had that effect that you're asking for, in a sense, all the time, here in Saskatchewan and in Canada and abroad. And I always find it incredibly refreshing. I'm not much of a shop talker when it comes to writing. I don't necessarily like meeting other writers and talking about how do you write a book. I'm not interested in that. But I love the creative vocabulary of people who have other artistic disciplines. So choreographers, painters, musicians. I love how they approach their art form. What I find really interesting with visual arts is process. How do they get to make their artwork? I find that particularly interesting because the result I can see, but I'm always curious to see how they get to it and how they speak of it. And not that this thing that isn't the thing itself, but how they got to the thing itself is I find it very interesting. So.
I agree. It's very interesting, and I think that's something we miss a lot sometimes in certain galleries and presentations of exhibitions. You don't always get to know the process behind it. That mystery is often there, but it's just a way to get to even understand what the artist was attempting if you know the process as well behind it. So when you've, like you said, you've always had this feeling where things grab your attention when you go, have you noticed any commonality between things when you're traveling that you're like, oh, I'm constantly attracted to this type of artwork, or is it a wide range
I'll discuss
for you?
the artwork that I have. My parents, for whatever reason, I should ask them, primarily like abstract art. So I'm generally attracted to abstract art because it defines less what I'm supposed to see. You look at a Mark Rothko or one of the paintings that I'm going to discuss, a Felipe Mayo, and it doesn't directly say what it's about. So it's much more open-ended. Now, not to say that, as I said, a picture of a cow is necessarily limited. I suppose a cow could be a starting point for an infinite number of reverberating thoughts. But I've always been attracted to abstract art. But generally, I'm a good traveler in that sense that I put myself in the situation of where I am and what's around me, and I open myself to what's there. So once again, Australia, Aborigine art has this there's a very pointillist style, sort of like Seurat.
Yes.
And I didn't know that until I went there. So I immersed myself in that. As it happens, I like Seurat, I like kind of pointillism. So I really appreciated all the Aborigine art that I saw in Australia, because that's the art that spoke to me then, because that's where I was. That was the reality around there, and this was the art that would help me understand the Australian reality. Yeah,
and I noticed there again, you talked about the process, that it was pointillism, that it had a different style to it. So it seems like that's something that does really capture you. Thank you for that. That was really interesting. And Tarah, I'd like to ask you the same kind of question when you're traveling or visiting, even just coming to Saskatoon from Vancouver, you're seeing a whole different section of Canadian art that you didn't always see in Vancouver. Is there been some commonality to things that do capture your attention?
That's a good question. I feel like I would need I'll need to live here for a lot longer before I make that comparison. But like the question of how we connect with art is obviously one that is really central to being a curator. And I think a lot about how people come to the moment of encounter with an artwork, and we all carry our experiences and our culture and worldview and our biases with us into that moment. And it is of course, it's a dialogue, right? Because you have the person that is bringing all of their baggage, so to speak, into that space, and you have the artwork itself and what kinds of associations it conjures for different viewers, and you have the intention of the artist. And I think I'm thinking a lot about the post-commodity exhibition, which just opened at Remy Modern last night. Because the work of that collective is of a kind of scale, and not only in size, yes, that they have
scale, yeah,
really large scale installations, but also a sort of a scale of gesture and of immersion into a space through kind of architectural or sonic or visual means. And so their work has this kind of confrontational quality that is useful for like thinking about the encounter with any kind of artwork, I think. And I don't think their work is confrontational in the sense that they are trying to dictate a particular message to the audience. I think actually the work that they have made for that exhibition very consciously contains a multitude of possible readings. And I think that is something that I'm really interested in, is artworks that I guess are kind of self-reflexive in the way that they take up space in a gallery. Of course, I have very personal attachments and stories like connected to the things that I have in my home, and those, I think about those things in terms of belonging, and the relationships that are connected to them, which is not like entirely dissimilar from thinking about the process of making meaning together with audiences and artists, because it is such a relational thing, but it's relational in a different way, I suppose.
Yeah. No, I love the points you made. A lot about physicality of the space, taking up the space. But I also love that you touched on that it's a dialogue between the viewer and the artwork, and it can be different for each viewer. That's something that's always interested me. Being an art lover my whole life, you constantly come up against other people that will not like what you like for various reasons, and it could be even hard to like I think Marie said this too, sometimes it's hard to even say what it is. It could be something very kind of nascent, and as you live with that piece it grows a little bit more, but it's just that initial connection, what's grabbing your attention, and then thinking about that and why has it grabbed your attention. So I like what you said about the show at the Reme, that the way you observed it last night was very much through kind of physical eyes, and how it was physically filling the space.
I think I'm in a physical frame of mind right now, because and this is kind of a bad analogy, but I had a really bad, I had a burning shoulder today, so I went for a last minute massage, and I was thinking afterwards about the analogy of getting a massage with the process of encountering an artwork, because you have this initial moment in the massage where you are put in pain.
Yes.
Kind of could be analogous to encountering an artwork for the first time and feeling shock, or even feeling like a certain kind of confusion at what you're encountering. And then, you know, as the masseuse works on your muscle, it sort of releases and you transition into this other kind of, maybe hopefully like better frame of being. And so I was thinking about that specifically in relation to the post-commodity show, which does kind of like, you know, they turned a number of Picassos around to face the wall, and you are left with a number of African and oceanic sculptures in the room. And so you are confronted with this gesture, and then you sort of like move through that initial moment of shock to coming into a different understanding of what's going on in the space. So that's my bad analogy.
No, it's a great analogy. I love that idea, because even I was thinking when you said about a massage, I'm like, well, of course it can sometimes begin with a little bit of discomfort, or like you said, pain too, right? Just even getting on the table and being all vulnerable in a towel and everything. I see that sort of discomfort with viewers a lot of times viewing certain artworks. I really enjoy artwork that has a very political side to it. My family, not so much. So I have some pieces that are not on display, but downstairs, because they do bring that reaction to people. And I always find if I find a piece that I do feel discomfort in, I tend to pay attention to it more, because I want to know, why is it making me uncomfortable? Why aren't I cool with this, right? So it can bring up a lot of great feelings. And again, like you said, touching on that dialogue between them, I think that feeling of discomfort sometimes with seeing artwork is a really important one, and we shouldn't turn away from it. There's always a reason down deep inside of there why you have that reaction. So thank you all for touching on that initial part. I just want to continue this discussion a little bit along a line, and then we'll get right into your personal collections. Those feelings that we were talking about, those visceral moments or kind of things that capture attention, whether it be physical or color or something uncanny, are those impressions that we get, those first impressions, are they immobile? Are they movable? So, you know, there's that old saying that mostly relates to us in society: you don't have a second chance to make a first impression. But I believe that artwork does, and people do too, right? You got to give people a break sometime. But I think artwork can continue to impress things upon you over and over again through it. So I want to start again with Marie. What is your feelings about those reactions to artwork, those first physical connections? Do they maintain along that level, or do you find they do morph and change?
One of the questions I ask myself when I live with works of art is, you know, if I had to choose one piece that I would live with on a desert island, if I was alone with one piece of art, which one would it be? And that has changed over time. There are certain pieces that resonate with me at certain moments in time and fade with time, and others come forward and resonate with me at that moment in time. So I think of it as a very fluid process. I don't think of it as anything static. And that's how I approach my own work. You know, things, I'll use the analogy of color. Color is always in the process of coming into being because of light. And with the changing of light over the course of a day and night, color changes in accordance with that. And I think there's a certain analogy to be made with work that, and now I'll talk about work that I live with, that I've actually specifically chosen to put in my home and live with on a daily basis. Again, I don't see it as a static experience. I see certain pieces in the house, for example, catching me out of the corner of my eye at specific times or specific moments. Whatever those may happen to be. But those kinds of moments are, you know, change with time. There are also pieces that we have that I think of in a generational way. I don't know whether this is responding to your question or not, but we have two sons, and our kids have families of their own, and we've made specific choices about work because we know that these things will pass on to the next generation, to our children, and that hopefully they will pass them on to their children as well. And so again, I see the appreciation of these pieces over long periods of time and as a generational kind of extension. And that's really, really important to me. And I ask my kids all the time, you know, what do you think of this? What do you think of that piece? Do you like this one? I mean, would you be able to live with this? You know, in response to what you're talking about, I'm talking about this in a very personal way, but I think this translates out into the larger community as well. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but there you go.
You did. You definitely, you said like it morphs. And I love what you touched on. What really struck me about what you said is how pieces in your collection that are hung around your house kind of move in and out of your space or your attention. And I want to circle back to that later because I think that's an important thing. I want to talk about, you know, the solace that we can find in artwork when necessary. And I think that's kind of what you're touching on, talking about things being more visible to you at times, even though they're hanging in your house all the time, but it's because perhaps you're drawn to that at that moment in time, like you said, depending on your mood or what's happening. So that's a great remark about living with art and how we interact with them. So now let's move on to Mr. Yann and see what he has to say about the same question. So we're asking, do you think that reaction, that visceral reaction that you have to artwork, is it immobile? And if not, how does it move and change for you?
Well, it definitely changes, because to me, what's unique about the language of art, and here I don't just mean visual art, but literary arts, musical arts, theatrical arts, all the arts, is that ambiguity is precisely inherent to it. You know, unlike, let's say, political language tends to be more fixed, right? The language of a constitution, the meaning tends to be fairly fixed, and judges try to sort of hone it so that it's clear. You don't necessarily want ambiguity in political language. The language of art is necessarily ambiguous, open-ended. It has a sort of infinity to it, and that's exactly why it's endlessly engaging, because your response evolves, changes over time, from passionate attachment to detachment to, you know. So for example, I mean, a very obvious example, right behind you, those 3 apples you have a work of art with 3 green apples.
Yeah, over here.
Side.
Wait, this way.
I look at those and I wonder, why 3 apples? Why are they green? You know, what could that mean? Garden of Eden.
I'm the one asking the questions here. I'm the one.
But see, looking at those, you could think it's very simple. It's just 3 apples. What does that mean, just 3 apples? Why green? Why apples? Why 3? You know, what's the material? That you live with, you know, sometimes you don't look at it, then you will look at it and you'll think about it. So I found all the artwork I've engaged with, there's always a lack of finality. You know, sometimes I'll just look at a very superficial element, just the color. You know, why does color please us? But, you know, colors please us. Why does bright red attract me one day? There's just something about it. And then I'll look, you know, a bit further back, and what does this whole thing mean? I'll give you a concrete example. Let's say Mark Rothko. I've always loved Mark Rothko. These lovely hovering squares. They're abstract, but they're sort of, you know, you can recognize squares. You know, what do they mean? Well, if you look through his career, toward the end of his life, before he offed himself, they were always black. Well, clearly he was depressed. So those, in fact, I find less interesting because they're emotionally quite clear. But all those earlier ones, they're so luminous, but they're ambiguous. Like, what do they mean? And they're very calming in some way, and you don't know why, and you don't know what they mean. And you know, he did variations on these themes of these soft volumes, and I've always loved seeing those, because I don't know what they mean, and that does not bother me, because it does feel like a dialogue. It's not like a foreign language that you don't understand, and initially it's interesting, but then because you don't understand it, you get bored with it. This is a sort of a dialogue where you don't understand exactly what it's saying, but you're still in that dialogue responding. And I also find that visual arts, for me, my approach is much less intellectual than, for example, my approach to literary arts. As a writer, you can't escape language, you can't escape spelling, syntax, grammar, some sense of meaning. I mean, you can completely dispense with meaning, but then no one will read your book as it being sensible, and it wouldn't be a dialogue.
Right.
What I love about visual arts is that lack of clear meaning and primarily emotional response. That's why when I go to Adgard, when I go to the Rami, when I used to go to the Mendel, I always felt like I was suddenly, I had so much oxygen in my lung, because I would suddenly like, oh, wow, I'd be electrified. And that was just primarily an emotional response. Whether it was, something fairly, like the Thelma Pepper recently that just ended there. Those are sort of black and white, very clear, that's a sort of a quiet little thing. Then you have things that blow you up, like this. I can't wait to see this post-commodity one. I just saw a picture of that enormous drum or whatever it is that's hanging at that. What is that about? I just love that it feels very lively. And it circumvents my intellect, which I find refreshing. After being cerebral in my work writing, it's nice to get that language that goes directly, that sort of doesn't entirely bypass the intellect, of course. Of course, there's intellectual input in visual arts, but its language isn't primarily, it's more sensorial. And I find that very invigorating, precisely because it's always ambivalent, ambiguous, ever changing. It's never definite. It's never definite. And I find that very lively.
Absolutely. I would say a similar thing to your artwork, your writing too. There's that ambivalence in it. So there's definitely similarities, but it's really exciting to hear your passion coming out and how exciting you're getting about talking about artwork already. It's great. Do you remember the first time you saw a Mark Rothko? Do you have any memory of how, like, were you quite, I imagine you're probably quite young if your parents took you a lot of places, but.
Where did I see my first Mark Rothko? I saw several in London. I've seen my first. It probably would have been in Paris, because my parents were posted in Paris, and I lived there 10 years in all. And I think that might have been the first time I saw an actual one, rather than, let's say, just a picture. But I think I think the first time I saw Mark Rothko would have been not a real one, but some kind of a show, a TV show, or maybe a book.
Okay.
A book on modern American art, and even then, even reduced to like a colored picture in a book, there was something about it. And then when you see the real thing, and he was obsessed, of course, with how they were hung and the lighting. And when you see them properly, it does feel like you've entered a cathedral in a religion you actually like and believe in. And it was extraordinary. So the most momentful impact I had with Rothko was in London, because the Tate Gallery. Is it the Tate Gallery? That has a whole bunch of them, and they're beautifully displayed, exactly like he wanted them. And like they have 10 or 12 of them, and it really blows you away.
That's wonderful. So that's an artist that you continue to revisit and enjoy.
I'd love to have one, but I don't think I can afford one.
I don't know. They're beautiful though. They really are. All right, Tarah, let's chat with you about that too, about those reactions we have, the same sort of thing. I think we've already kind of come to the conclusion they're definitely malleable and movable and how they work. So since this question is kind of morphed a little bit, why don't we just talk about kind of similar to the way Yann did, saying, those Mark Rothkos, they've gotten him from the beginning. Is there any particular artist or artwork that touched you at a younger age that's continued to resonate with you throughout your life?
Actually, the whole time, I thought Yann, you spoke really beautifully to like what is inherent within an artwork that allows for that continual process of meaning making and that sort of evolution of it. But then it got me thinking about, I'm going to not answer that question because I was thinking about something else. I was thinking about Emily Carr.
Oh, yes. Oh, great.
Yeah. So coming to the Vancouver Art Gallery, like Emily Carr was impossible to avoid. And I, didn't begin as a curator thinking that I would ever work with Emily Carr. And I think I probably held, and probably still do, have some prejudice against her as an artist, because of of course we know that part of what she did was to appropriate Indigenous cultural material because of a misplaced belief in the sort of vanishing race theory. However, so I think it's like, you know, Emily Carr is such a heavily researched and heavily debated artist that she is a very good example of how the meaning, the interpretation of artworks evolve over time, because, you know, you have the artist's own writing and journals in which you sort of variously have the artist kind of mythologizing herself in a way, while also having these like moments of kind of profound clarity. But you know, we're always reading into that from our present moment. And you know, one of the projects that I the project that I ended up working on that included work by Carr was called Lineages and Land Bases. And at the center of the exhibition, it was a look at the 33-year friendship between Carr and Sophie Frank, who is a basket maker from the Squamish Nation. And we drew a lot of inspiration for that show from a book written by Christy Belcourt, who did like a lot of, you know, primary research with the community at Squamish over a number of years. And she very carefully does like a visual analysis of Carr's late oil on paper landscape paintings, which are Carr at her most sort of fluid and vibrant expression of what she kind of saw as the spirit in the natural world, with the, you know, techniques of basket making in Salish territories, and looking at how the process of making for both artists sort of embedded this worldview into the work that has a lot of resonance with one another, but also is, of course, very differently informed. Carr being like, you know, having encountered like vitalism and theosophy and her knowledge of abstract representation in art. And working on that project opened up such a complex set of questions around Carr's intention, her like obviously deep affection for this woman who, when she wrote about her, also like wrote about her in sort of disparaging terms, which were of course informed by the Victorian era that Carr was raised in. And you know, this is like kind of the art historical deep dive, although I'm like definitely not an art historian either. But that often doesn't like make it onto the text panels in museums. And so the trap, of course, is that we fall into this sort of endless repetition of the like known facts about this artist, and a kind of narrative about the artist becomes reified. So, but I think that people have variously tried to recuperate Carr in different ways or have really maligned her. And that has, you know, really changed over time. So I feel like Carr is not done with me yet.
That was great. Thank you for taking us down that path.
Can I just jump in?
Emily Carr is, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yes,
No.
yes,
Mhm.
yeah.
Sorry. That was great. I'm very happy that you mentioned Emily Carr, Tarah, because my parents, I said, as diplomats, my father was in the cultural stream. And so one of the jobs he had in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was promoting Canadian culture. And of course, Emily Carr was a perfect candidate for that.
Yeah.
And also, you know, when I was a kid, I loved Emily Carr. I read her book. She wrote a book called Clee Wick. She was a very good writer.
Yeah.
And as a feminist, I loved her because here was a woman who really struggled. I mean, she was unknown. She was miserable. She had to run a rooming house. She only had dogs. And so, and yet she triumphed, sort of like Van Gogh. Despite the adversity, she ultimately triumphed. And if you know nothing of the history, if you just see the pictures, they're so beautiful. These cathedrals in the forest. And so I remember loving Emily Carr. She was a poster child of, great Canadian art. But then you're totally right. Then when you clue in as to what she was doing, total voice appropriation, totally going there with her big heavy boots and painting indigenous things seen through her eyes. Total, she sinned totally. And so it's a perfect example of the ambiguity of, can a bad person do good art? Could someone with poor intentions still pull off great art? Is it still great art? It speaks to the. So now when I see Emily Carr, and not too long ago, there's a show of her stuff in London, in a gallery in South London. My partner's English, and it was a whole bunch of Emily Carr, and they made no mention of that really, because that was too current, I guess, for the English art scene to be talking about what we're talking about all the time now in Canada. But now when I see Emily Carr, yes, I appreciate the aesthetics, but I'm seeing the sort of how morally it's insidious here, that this was painted on the bones of people who suffered. And she maybe wasn't aware of that. Maybe she was, but she didn't care because she wanted to get her beautiful painting done. But still, someone who struggled through obscurity and adversity. So it's endlessly interesting. So it adds to what I was saying, the ambiguity. Here's a person who's now morally compromised. What do we do with it? We obviously don't want to burn it, because what do we achieve with that? We need to sort of talk about it more, explain it more, so people can come to it with a greater understanding, and coming out of it with greater understanding.
Yeah.
Can I also add? I mean, I'm diverging from Emily Carr, I'm afraid, but I do want to point out, I'm going back to Mark Rothko and bringing forward a name, Agnes Martin, who I think is a female equivalent to the kind of painting that Rothko was actually involved with, and someone who was very interested in light and geographic place, and these kinds of personal but yet universal themes in her work that again, we can revisit over time and pull out threads that connect us over time, which I think is really, really important. And again, it's sort of like what you said, Yann, about meaning being not fixed. Emotional response to these works is what connects us over the generations and throughout time as well. And I think she's a really good example of someone who we're able to revisit over and over and over again, because her work continues to speak to the human condition.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I have to tell my Emily Carr story. So we all have one, right? I grew up in Toronto and spent almost every Saturday at the Royal Ontario Museum, which I was 100% sure that's where I was going to work when I grew up, in the basement with the mummies and all the lovely trinkets and things of the past, because I love history and society. And I actually started my major in archaeology and anthropology and then switched to art history. So I still have that undying love. But for some reason in the Royal Ontario Museum, in their stairwell, there were some Emily Carr small little watercolors in there. So I had been looking at those since like the age of 7 and really enjoyed them. And then as your world develops, see her name on the spine of a book in the library. So I have to read that. And so I had a similar journey, like Tarah was saying. I'm constantly learning about this artist and her intentions and what she was about. So my relationship with her as a very young child and looking at these beautiful little moments of watercolors that were kind of juxtaposed next to suits of armor and dinosaur bones. It was a beautiful little escape. And then you read more about the artist, you see more of her artwork, it develops. I actually got to see a beautiful exhibition of hers at the Greater Art Gallery of Victoria a few years ago. That was really, really eye-opening as well. So I like that we all found that little thread of connection, but she's a great example of how somebody's artwork can continue to change our reaction to that artwork the more we know about the artist, and perhaps even the more we know about ourselves. So I want to jump right into artwork now. Yes, go ahead.
It speaks to the fact that beauty has no moral quality. You know, someone who's beautiful isn't necessarily a good person. Art that is beautiful isn't necessarily coming from a morally good place. So that's what's very engaging about visual arts. In fact, all the arts is beauty is an ambiguous quality to something. Yes, it's attractive, but its origin isn't necessarily as pure as the effect it has on us. You know, sort of the uplifting effect may not come from uplifting emotions from the artist. As I said, necessarily good artists, you know, good people aren't necessarily good artists.
Yeah, but that's a great aspect. That could be a whole nother session too about the artwork. There's been a lot of controversy over the past, 15 to 20 years about revisiting artists, not just visual artists, but writers, directors, people all through. How can we change our reaction to their artwork knowing what we know about them now? So that's a good, well, I'll write that down for next year. That'll be a session for next year for sure. So now I want to get into showing the artwork that the three of you have agreed to share with us from your personal collection, and talking about some of those reactions and maybe just kind of your relationships to the artwork. So just give me a sec here to get this slideshow set up, and I'll start sharing it with everybody. And we can go through, I want to touch on, I think, for each of you, one piece first from each of your collections, and then we'll go back and look at more from each person. But I'm going to pick one piece for you directly to talk about. And I think we can start with Marie. So just one moment here while I get this set up and shared with you guys. Feel free to take a quick little break if you need it. And I think if I start this here, there we are. So you guys should all be able to see the screen now. This is going to circulate through some artwork, but I just want to move ahead and go to, and sorry if you're watching this, we're going to come back and talk about all these pieces. We'll get to see them all throughout the evening, but first I just want to start with Marie's collection. So we're going to zip through here. You can ooh and ah along the way. Whoops, we're going to go back to that one there, Marie, that I just had up. One moment. Go down, here we are. Okay. Oh, it didn't do what I wanted to do. So sorry, guys, just one second. Always technical difficulties. Okay, I'm gonna try to pause it here. Hopefully I can. And we'll talk about these two pieces here, Marie. Oh my goodness.
Oops.
Whoops is right. One moment, let's get back to that piece. Okay, I'm gonna see if I can zoom now. Okay, y'all can see that art Mackay, and now it's going away. One moment, team, so sorry. There we are. There's going to be no slideshow. It's just going to be static because this isn't doing me good here. So let me see if I can make this piece bigger and we can have a look at this lovely art Mackay. Okay, how about we talk about this piece, Tarah? Oh my goodness, yes. Okay, one moment. I'm going to just jump back into the file as it was from the beginning.
The way you had it just a second ago was fine.
Oh.
Yeah, just leave it like that in the small.
Yeah, I'm just going to leave it like this. I'm sorry for the ugliness of my screen, but that's how we're going to roll with it today. Okay, there we're going to start with this lovely piece. As you can see, it's in the collection of Marie Lanew, and it's made by the lovely Art Mackay. So Marie, I'm going to have you take it away. And I'd like to, when you're talking about this piece, give a little background to it, but also keep in mind some of those things we touched about, your like initial visceral reaction to this artwork and how that's changed throughout the time that you've been living with it in your collection.
This was a gift from my husband on my 50th birthday. And we often exchange gifts like this, buying each other works of art that we know our partners are very interested in. And I'm an abstract painter, and Art Mackay is part of a very historically significant group of painters called the Regina Five. And of that group of painters, he was the one that I responded to, I think, most closely and most viscerally for a number of reasons. I mean, the circle form, the mandala form was a really important geometric form in my own work. Technically, the surfaces of these paintings, the color of these paintings, just my emotional reaction and response to these very minimal, powerful works. I just always loved seeing Art Mackay in exhibition, and I have a number of his catalogs. And so this work became available, and Danny ended up finding it and buying it for me. So it was a complete surprise. And it's one of the pieces in our collection that I love. One of the most important pieces for me in the collection, just because it connects so closely with the work that I'm doing. And it also connects me to the history of abstraction in Saskatchewan, which is really significant to my practice and something that I keep in mind when I'm doing my own work. It's a very meditative, quiet, contemplative kind of a piece, which speaks to me. It has simply not diminished over time for me. I mean, I still love it as much as the day that I received it. And I don't think it will diminish in time. I mean, I just feel very close to this particular piece and to Art Mackay's work in general. And there was a second image of a sculptural piece that was below it. And yeah, that down the next one. Well, yeah, do that one. So this is an example of how we collect. Art Mackay is at the top, and there's a young emerging artist from Calgary by the name of Jessie Stillwell, whose sculptural piece is at the bottom. And both of these artists are working within abstraction. Jessie is a colorist and doing, I think, really interesting things in his practice with color, and hanging two generations, one above the other, for me, increases the dialogue and the conversation between the work and the dialogue and conversation that I can have, or whoever happens to be in the house looking at these pieces. They can ask questions about why these two together, and I have all sorts of answers for them. I really like this. Things change over the generations, and the juxtaposition of these two pieces, or the connection between these two works together in the house, I think really speaks to this notion of dialogue over time between the generations.
Oh, Kimberley, you're muted.
What? Say that again?
There we are. Now you'll be able to hear me.
Oops.
I said, I really like the way you have this set up in your home, and you're very, purposely putting those generations together to sort of see that similarity and that dissimilarity between their work. So this is Jessie Stillwell, is that correct?
Yeah. And I'd like to say that the reason Jessie, I've been following his work. I've never actually met Jessie. He's an artist from Calgary. I've seen his work online, and I've just really been interested in him over time. I've followed him on Instagram for a number of years, and I have a project space in my studio space the 330G one. And I invited him to participate in an exhibition recently, an exhibition on painting in Western Canada. And this was one of the pieces of his that I was very interested in showcasing because it's a three-dimensional expose of color. Art Mackay's piece is on a two-dimensional surface, on a flat surface. You know, Jessie is actually pulling color, the full spectrum of color, out into space. And again, you know, those two kinds of divergent positions in terms of the piece really interest me. But you know, 330G is an opportunity for me to invite artists from away to showcase their work in Saskatoon. And I pay for everything that takes place in that space. So I really have to like the work of someone to invite them to show their work. And he's a young artist. I'm continue to be very, very interested in, and I look forward to following his progress in the future.
Oh, thank you for sharing that new artist with us. I want to ask, I'm just going to go back to the Art Mackay. Do you recall when you first encountered Art Mackay's work?
I do. It was in Regina at the old Mackenzie Art Gallery. Okay, so it was called the Mackenzie Art Gallery then, right? At the in the university building. Yes. I saw a big show of their work, the Regina 5 at the Mackenzie Art Gallery. And the piece that we have is 24 by 24 inches, 2 feet square. But I mean, I remember the Mackays, these giant, beautiful, stunning pieces where you would stand in front of these and your body was just kind of completely implicated into the paint, you know, like, whatever, it was just immersed into this incredible painting. And it was just a full body experience, body and mind experience for me. And that resonated with me and has stayed with me for a long time, to the point where Danny, as a surprise, bought me this piece because he knew what a big impact this particular artist from here, from my geographic place in the world, had on me.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. And you know, the Regina 5 too, that's an amazing part of Saskatchewan history that I think is quite overlooked often. Right in our province here. I think that's, you know, not being from Saskatchewan originally, that's my one critique I'm going to tell you Saskatchewan people: be proud of what you have going on in this province. It's fantastic. It's really wonderful. And the Regina 5 is a great historical part of that. So I would just want to ask you, Marie, you said when you saw this at the Mackenzie Art Gallery, when it used to be with the College Avenue buildings, were you a practicing artist at the time? Were you in art school at the time? Do you recall?
I was in art school. Then, yeah. So it was very, very early on in my career.
And so would you say, looking at Art Mackay's work, the color in it influenced you at all in your practice?
I don't know at that particular, are you talking about that particular moment in time? I don't know that it was specifically the color, or if it was the color, I didn't recognize it as being the color that particularly influenced me. I think the simplicity of it, the minimalism, the contemplative nature, you know, to reduce a painting to basically 2 elements. These 2 elements have to resonate in the highest qualitative order for you to be engaged with this piece over time, you know, and not lose interest in it. And so the decisions that he made in putting this painting together, maybe that's what it was that really resonated with me the most. You know, how can you make something so simple be so meaningful? You know, how can you animate inanimate material in a way that I'm still engaged with this painting in my house, and I've had it for a number of years, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, let's go.
That's the job of an artist. That's what you try to do, whether you're a visual artist, a writer, or whatever. I mean, you want to engage people and continue their interest level in your work, you know.
100%. Absolutely. And that's what Yann was kind of talking about too, that process, like that decision for this artist just to make these 2 colors and textures together, and what it ended up creating in the end is just absolutely incredible. So getting not just the final composition, but the process, the decisions that he made as well in creating that piece. And it's lovely to hear you say it's just continued to be a very strong piece in your collection and in your life.
Well, and also as an artist, you want to distill the decisions that you make in terms of your own work to the ones that are the most profoundly meaningful and that resonate over time. You know, I mean, it sounds very grandiose, but that's what you're trying to do. You know, and that capture your attention first and foremost over time. And then hopefully that translates to the viewer as well.
Absolutely. Beautiful piece. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go to Yann now. We're going to start with a piece that I know he's very passionate about, by Felipe Mayo. Yeah, you'll have to unmute.
Yeah, do the other Mayo. That's the smaller one.
Oh, the red one. Oh,
Yeah,
I don't think
the
I
one at
have
the
that on
top.
here. Can you talk to this one?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fine. They're all the same. They're
No, they're not.
of the same style. Okay, well, Felipe Mayo is a painter no one will have heard of. He was a painter my family and I knew in France. My parents were posted to Paris in 1972, and Philippe Mayo was a painter born in 1940 in the Auvergne, in the south of France. And as it happens, his girlfriend worked at the Canadian Cultural Center in Paris, and my father therefore met her, and through her met him. And he was born in 1940, so he's 28 years old when May 68 rocked the streets of Paris. And Philippe never got over May 68. He was, for the rest of his life, an anarchist against any form of authority, which is great, made him a very colorful personality, but made him a very limited artist in the sense that he had great motivation to paint and passion to paint, but he was incapable of then having his artwork interact with the world. He was always uncomfortable with the idea of what do you do with your artwork? How do you interact with the viewer? Because if you're a serious artist, at one point, you have to make peace with the commerce of art. You have to make peace with the fact that your artwork has to be given some kind of value. You have to somehow interact in a commercial way. And Philippe could never accept that. So he always failed to sell himself. His girlfriend tried as best as she could. There's some dentist somewhere in Switzerland who loved his stuff, bought a lot, then he died. So Philippe had, in a sense, a very circumscribed career. But this is an example. We have several. I have a larger one, and in fact, I have one right behind me. I know you can't see, but I have another one in my studio here. And so this is stuff. So my parents moved in 72, met Philippe in 72. So he was 32 years old. And you can see this is abstract. What is this? It looks like maybe a molar tooth. What is it? It's abstract art. There's no direct meaning to be gained from it, no obvious figurative meaning to be got from it. So as a kid, because we've had this since I was a kid. I mean, I was born in 63. So, I was 11 years old when I encountered this. My parents started buying Philippe's stuff. We have several. And I got several off my parents in the last few years. And what I liked about this, even as a child, is since there was nothing to be understood directly in it, it didn't box me in. And so I look at the Mayos, and I always end up looking at the materiality of it, the physicality of the color, the greens, the reds, the whites, the white shape there. And my mind kind of wanders. It travels in a landscape. And so in a sense, while I'm looking at his stuff, my mind is wandering and freely, lightly, untethered to any particular thoughts. And I like that. It's kind of like yoga. It's kind of like a yoga, but done through painting. So what I like about these is I still look, 50 years on, I look at these and I still wander around them like I'm traveling, Italy. This is art that I grew up with. This is sort of imprinted itself very early on me, and formed my sensibility. I guess I like abstract painting in part because I encountered these Philippe Mayo, and hence I've sought abstract art since then. When I first encountered Jackson Pollock, for example, it's very different from this, but it's of that same order of the materiality of art, the physicality of it, completely ambiguous. It's a sensibility that you live with if you like abstract art. You like color, you like light. so this is art that, you know, I was in a sense, my sense as a visual artist lover, this is what I was born with. And this I'm always attracted to the abstract because it doesn't box me in. It enhances my freedom and lifts it up. You know, because this is obviously not just a banal scratch on a wall that would be just a mistake. This was very much deliberate and the result of a whole person's, you know, expression of his very humanity. So it's very rich, but in a completely baffling way, but it speaks to my humanity and elevates it. So of the three artworks that I want to talk about, this is the, you know, this is the earliest one. This, I can't even explain why I like it. I just do. It's a pure visceral connection that opens me up and elevates me.
Have you found your relationship with this artwork, having lived with it since you were a child, has your relationship with this artwork changed over the years?
Well, in this case, no, but that's not a negative answer. It
No,
doesn't mean that it's settled. You know, he died in 2005 of flu. He sort of drowned in his own lungs, which is very sad. So it's tinged now with a little bit of nostalgia, I suppose. I'm getting older, so I suppose there's a little bit of, it brings me back to a certain past, but not entirely. It still speaks to me right now. Like right now, I look at sort of the vein between the two columns there, that sort of twist of little colors, and I sort of just, I look at them. I just look at them, and my eye doesn't rove. It just settles there. So no,
it's
it has
lovely.
a little tinge of nostalgia, but otherwise, no, it's still this lively incomprehension.
I love so much what you said about it frees your mind. You can go in there and you're not stuck because it's not representative art. You're not tied to what it's supposed to be. You're allowed some freedom in your mind. And the way you spoke about it was almost therapeutic. In fact, you said yoga. It's like yoga. It just takes you to a certain place. What a wonderful piece to grow up with. And it's so lovely you still have that in your life. We're going to jump over to Tarah, and I'm going to start with this piece. That's, whoa, sorry, there we go. Got scared there for a minute. So do you want to talk about this work, Tarah? I know it's pretty recent, but I'm sure your history with Ruth and your knowledge of her is probably quite extensive. So I'd love to hear your insights on this piece and how you've lived with it or currently are now living with it.
I'm actually not living with it yet.
Oh no.
Waiting for me to pick it up at art placement. Yeah, so I'm this is a screen print of one of Ruth's beaded works of the COVID-19 virus. And this edition of 50 prints was produced as a fundraiser by AKA, the Artist Run Center here in Saskatoon, which that fundraiser happened very shortly after I moved here. And while we were in the process of planning for the exhibition, An Apology, a Pill, a Ritual, a Resistance, which included 3 new beaded COVID-19 works by Ruth, which the museum acquired from her. A very exciting moment always when you can support artists that you're working with in that way within the institution, obviously. I've had some interesting conversations with my husband about this work and the kind of unease that we both feel about living with this obviously very alluring image of the virus that has, caused so much devastation over the last 2 years. Today, during the tour of Post Commodities exhibition, they said that in the US, they lost 250,000 elders from COVID.
Wow.
And
that's a lot of knowledge, that
yeah.
bypassed.
And so, so this work is in large part is like it's not a positive work, you know, but there is this tension that Ruth has articulated really powerfully in her beaded diseases over, I think, over a number of different series now, which you know, all sort of address the survival of Indigenous communities through epidemics and pandemics. And also, like within the context of the exhibition, the sort of stark contrast between the like visual pleasure of the beads and the skill that it takes to create, and then the very dark feelings that the work elicits was a very powerful kind of illustration of the idea of the pharmacon, which we were exploring in the show, which in which the remedy can also be a poison to your body, you know. So this kind of like the sort of the duality of like living through illness or disease and what we have to do to heal from it. So I really don't know yet where we're going to hang this work in the house. Like, it feels very loaded. I feel like I might put it in my office, because it feels like having it in the living space where a lot of the work that we have, like the Christy Belcourt behind me, is like, although one of the other works I have on here is a little ambiguous too, but I mean, for me, it will be kind of this, it will be a reminder of what we have been living through and how extraordinary these, you know, the last couple of years has been, and, you know, and the resilience of Indigenous communities in the face of, you know, in the face of colonization and the waves of disease that came with it, and of the deep respect that I have for Ruth. So
yeah, Ruth has done amazing work with this, and like you say, there's multiple series that build off of this. The thing that really hits me about this one is because I'm looking at sort of a lot of the diseases in her first collection that she brought out were really specific to the destruction of Aboriginal groups across Canada. Whereas this one here, it's more current to us. It's, you know, in some ways, I don't find this as impactful as others, but in other ways, it's too impactful for me to look at it. You know, it's going to be interesting. I'm interested to hear how you feel about it moving on, because it speaks right to our heart right now, where we're doing what we're going through, what we're all going through. But yeah, Ruth Cuthand, for those of you who may not have encountered her work, please look her up, look at what she does. She does some amazing work with beads, not just technically, but in the message that she has, that she puts through her artwork. I really admire Ruth and all the work that she's done. And from here, I'm going to switch over to this work here that belongs to Yann Martel, which is another piece of Ruth's. This is a little bit earlier, so you can see the text. She often will change the text up. And the difference between this one and the one we just looked at is this is the bead. This is not, the other one is, what is it? Is it a laser etching? Is it
the screen
print, the 7 screen print, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas here we have the handwork beads on the background that is flocked, and the writing on the back. Whoops, sorry there, Yann. So, Yann, do you want to talk to this?
Yeah,
about this piece and your relationship with this, and how it's been having this in your life since you've purchased it?
Well, it came into my house like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, really? Wow.
This is the most recent one. Well, so I said Felipe Mayo was like what I grew up with. I don't even know why I like it. I just like it. It's part of my visual art DNA. What I love about Ruth Cuthand is this speaks to, I think, art's relationship with history. I mean, there's a very curious mix here of the attractive and the repellent. I mean, they're visually beautiful. Beading is beautiful. It's particularly bright. She delivered it on a very matte background, so it really stands out. I'm sorry about the poor photography, by the way. I'm not a
Oh, it's
photographer.
good.
You know, of course, you have to see the thing itself, but it's really luminous. The little, so it's on the one hand, just even if you knew nothing about it, if the word smallpox wasn't there, you might think, oh, it's abstract work. It's, I don't know, three little canoes or who knows what it is. But once you know what it is, the fact that it's beautiful is also kind of repelling because it's a disease that killed, you know, hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. There's an irony here. Like she uses beauty to attract you and then she repels you by saying this killed, you know, half my people. So this speaks to how art isn't necessarily comfortable. You don't just want to be surrounded by prettiness because in fact, prettiness is kind of vapid. I mean, real beauty has power, but it can't just be beauty because otherwise it's not saying much. This is beautifully uncomfortable. You know, it speaks to the current reality we're living in. It speaks entirely of settler colonialism, but, and this is why it works, you couldn't live with something that really, I mean, listen, I'm an overprivileged white male from the settler colonial culture. You know, I'm the enemy here. I couldn't live with that being screamed in my face all the day. You have to at one point accept who you are and the circumstances in which you were born and try to make peace with it. So acquiring this artwork, I don't like that it's private, that only people come to my house see it. I do really believe in public art so everyone can see her stuff. But she does it with a certain lightness, a certain degree of irony. You know, she takes on an art form that's typically indigenous, beadwork, but she uses it to throw in the face of the viewer what settler colonialists have done to her people. So there's a mixture of it's a gentle, it's, you know, like it's nearly a gentle irony. It's very powerful, but it's not, doesn't hit you on the head. You know, you look at it and you engage with it and therefore you feel terrible. And, you know, the word that it says smallpox, you know, I like that also, the mixture of the visual and the literary, that it says that. And the other thing too that's great about Ruth Cutnahan, and I'll mention another artist that I didn't put in here because I don't own it. I gave it to the Ramey. What's great about Ruth Cutnahan is that kind of art where you see it and right away you get it. Whereas Felipe Mayo, as I said, you don't get it, and that's part of it. Ruth Cutnahan, in a sense, you get it. You get it. Oh, it's beadwork, it's indigenous, but it's talking about the diseases that the settlers brought. I get it. Now that doesn't mean it's boxed in. You still play with it, not only visually. You bathe in the colors, the shape, but you also bathe more uncomfortably in the history of, yes, these white people came, wrecked this culture. Now we're 200 years onwards, we're still living with that very much every day. What do we do with it? This work makes me think of that every time I look at it. It makes me uncomfortable, but not in the way it makes me want to shut down and not dialogue because I feel guilty. No, it makes us, what do I do now? Well, I support indigenous artists. I open myself to what they have to say. I accept my guilt, but I move on from that. I say, you know, we go towards a place of truth and reconciliation by accepting their suffering, not taking it on as our own. It's theirs. We accept it as we're part of the cause. We're the descendant of those who caused it. You know, it makes me dialogue with it. Another artist I want to mention that I don't own. There's a wonderful. He lives outside Saskatchewan, an artist named Clint Neufeld, and I donated one of his pieces to the Ramey. He does this stuff where he takes big pieces of motors and he turns them into porcelain replicas. Yeah. So he takes this very sort of traditionally male stuff, you'd think, a big engine, big ugly engine, turns it into these beautiful ceramic things, and then he paints them in these beautiful pale colors with like little flowers. And what's interesting about him is it's that same thing. You look at it, you get it, and then you dialogue with it. So him, it's this mixture, this dialogue between the male and the masculine and the feminine. So this is artwork that you understand right away, but that doesn't mean you've stopped dialoguing with it. You still look at it, it makes you question about, you know, in his case, the ugliness, it's not particularly ugly, of a big, you know, a tractor engine. And yet these delicate little flowers he's put on them in this beautiful, you know, fragile thing called porcelain. It's this sort of dialogue of, I know what you're talking about, but we're just starting yet. And so Clint has this wonderful piece that the Ramey has. And it's kind of that same universe of artwork that is understandable, and yet you that's just the beginning of it. You get what the artist is trying to do, and then you go on from there. So Ruth is a wonderful example of that, and to me, an example of art speaking about history and how we live in history, live with history. What do we do with it? But, you know, using the medium of visual arts.
Yeah, it's beautiful. They're strong, and even like you said, how it connects to history. I even love the presentation of it. It's got that mode of collecting, which colonization was also a lot about. Let's grab what we can from this land and put it in a box and label it and behind glass and take it back to show everybody. So I get that feeling from it too. So deep and wonderful. So like I said before to our audience, check out Ruth Cut Hand. And I see we're already at 8:30 and we haven't even begun to talk. So I'm going to pick one more from, I have to go to Tarah again, sorry, because this piece intrigues me so much. I just love it. If you can talk about this, I'm going to just quickly show you the accompanying photo with it as well. And then from here, we're going to jump over to Marie and then back to Yann to conclude. So Tarah, take it away and let us know about this piece, the story behind it, and how you've been living with it.
So this is a portrait mask of me by the Haida artist Corey Bullpit. It was made as one of a series of 3 masks. He also made masks for Peter Morin and Ayumi Goto, who are the 2 artists that I worked with for my first exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery, which was called How Do You Carry the Land? As soon as I invited Ayumi and Peter to collaborate, they opened the circle and brought in a number of other artists into the project, and Corey was one of them. And many of the pieces that these other artists contributed were sort of gentle interventions into the built environment of the Vancouver Art Gallery, which, if you have ever been there, is a very sort of neoclassical. I mean, it was the provincial courtyard. It has this very, has a prison in the basement. It had a land claims office. It's like a very heavy with history kind of building. And then some of the works that other artists contributed were activated in performance. And Ayumi and Peter asked me to perform with them. And so the performance that we did, which is the part of that second image, was called This Is Not Us. And we donned the masks and did a series of actions throughout a number of different exhibitions that were on at the museum at the time, including, on the 4th floor where the Emily Carrs live. And into the courtroom, which is like now a meeting space, but the director of the Vancouver Art Gallery's office occupies the former judge's office. So it has this, this sort of this layering of history and of structures of power in it that the performance was responding to. And in the exhibition itself, the masks were installed on stands that were the same height as Ayumi and Peter and I, and the 3 of us were placed in different rooms observing. So Peter's mask was in Ayumi's room. Ayumi's room was in Peter's room. Sorry, mask was in Peter's room, and my mask was in the central room. And so the exhibition was the sort of, and working with Ayumi and Peter was the most sort of joyful disruption of the sort of day-to-day working rhythms at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and the exhibition was that as well, with the sort of prioritizing of performance and the presence of these artists in the space, and my understanding of the possibilities of the moment of encounter with art are in large part, I have learned those from working with Ayumi and Peter. And so we applied for a grant from the Canada Council to help support some of the work being made for the show. And so we paid Corey to make these masks of us, and at the end of the show, he gifted them to us. So we're all living with our the portraits of ourselves in the mask form. And of course, you know, being the Vancouver Art Gallery and the sort of particular history that gallery has with Northwest Coast art, which is a very rich but also, you know, complex history. Having an artist like Corey Bullpit, who's Haida and like grew up living in East Vancouver, make these masks for us was very special. So.
Gorgeous piece. I love Corey's work. I've been following him a lot for a long time, and he always does beautiful things. He has a nice edge of modernity to his work, but like as we were talking to, it speaks to the history and the stories that are behind our land and what's been going on here. How do you feel this piece reflects your choice in the artwork that you collect in your life?
Relationships, I would say. Yeah, I guess like that kind of says it all, but like most that I have are artists that that I've worked closely with and have, you know, developed close relationships with, and some things have been gifted and some things I've sought out. Like I needed this was the first work, the Christy Belcourt was the first work that we had to put up, you know, coming to live in the Métis homeland, and, you know, having the work of our most, like one of our most important artists. That was, you know, that was important to me.
Yeah,
So.
Christy's work is beautiful too. Thank you for that. We're gonna go down to Marie. Marie, you've got so many beautiful pieces here. I'm going to ask you, which one do you want to talk about?
I mean,
I wish we had time to talk about them all. We could, if people don't mind staying up till 11. I'm totally great continuing this conversation.
Let's go two up to the colorful one, because there's an interesting, it's very interesting technically. I mean, all of the work would be great to talk about all of them. But anyway, this is by an artist in Toronto by the name of Mcclelland. And I am a colorist, and I spoke about Neil's work earlier on in the discussion and the ingenious way in which he had come up with activating color on the surface of this piece. So what this artist did was the following. This is a piece of absorbent Japanese paper. He folded this paper around a color printer cartridge that he had poked holes in with a pin. So he, just imagine folding this around this cartridge. So, I mean, maybe it's 2 by 2 inches or 2 by 3 inches or whatever. Then he put that in a plastic bag, and he put that plastic bag in his pocket, and he lived his life over the course of a month, walking around, working in his studio, doing what you do. And when he took the bag out of his pocket and opened up this work and separated it from the printer cartridge, this is what he was left with. And he's done a series of these pieces. They're sort of like, they look batik-esque, but I had simply never been introduced conceptually to this idea of producing color in this way. And I was just immediately captivated and struck by just the ingenuity of coming up with this idea. And I was so jealous, you know, why hadn't I thought of it? You know, I just think it's absolutely stunningly beautiful, and an organically created painting based on him walking around and living his life, you know, immersed in his pocket of his pants. Oh, I just, you know, close to his body, creating all of the colors of the spectrum. For an artist, for me as an artist, it was just, you know, it just opens your mind up to the possibilities and potential of color production, let's say. I'm talking specifically about this piece, but it could be much more general. you know, how incredibly inventive and creative artists can be and really inspire. You know, he has really inspired my practice in the studio. And, you know, it's definitely one of the pieces, again, I'm fond of all of the work that we have, but it strikes such a strong chord with the type of work that I'm doing in my own studio, although it's very, very different than what I'm doing. But again, his inventiveness, just the creativity and the simplicity of the gesture of what he did too is just really mind-bogglingly great. So I love looking at it. I also love the fact that it's uninhibited. You know, it is just a full bore blast of color. And a lot of people don't like that. It's too, you know,
bold,
extreme, or it's too whatever. And I just say, bring it on. I think it's absolutely stunningly gorgeous. And the backstory of it makes the piece even more resonant for me.
Absolutely. What is the scale of this work, Marie? What is the size of this work?
It's 2.5 feet long, and it's about 2 feet wide and 2.5 feet long.
So it's a substantial size. And yeah, the process involved in this, not knowing the process, you can definitely engage and enjoy this work. Like I'm looking at the nice deep crease lines in there. It almost reads to me like Moroccan tile or something that was made very deliberately. But he kind of, like you said, it's more of an organic process in this.
And a lot of associations that you can bring to this when you're
absolutely depend on where you're situated as
well, and draw on other cultures and other timelines as well, like the 60s, for example, or the 70s, you know. Anyway, it's just, I don't know, I love it. I absolutely love it. And I'm very happy I have it in my life.
It's a gorgeous, gorgeous piece. I want to go back up here into this piece. This is a piece I've been wanting to hear a lot about. This is from the collection of Yann again. So do you want to tell us your journey with this piece?
Yeah, sure. Well, viewers can see also to the left there above the Michel Boutin, another one, that sort of landscape there. I'll speak of both of those actually. Maybe you could switch between the two of them just for a second. So that one you can't quite see because it's such a poor photograph, but it's the painting is extremely thick.
Yes, very textural.
So this is Ken Dalgarno, who's a Saskatchewan artist. He lives in Moose Jaw. He was born in '63. And the other one is by a Métis artist named Michel Boutin. The Dalgarno I got a few years ago, and the Boutin was a more recent acquisition. I think we got it last year. That one, once again, is I'm originally from Quebec, but I lived abroad a lot. I came to Saskatchewan in 2003, so I'm fairly recent to the prairies. And therefore, it's fairly recent, my encounter with the Indigenous people of Canada. When I was living abroad, they didn't exist. And when I lived in Canada, I mostly lived in big cities, either Ottawa or Montreal, where shamefully, they were mostly invisible. I mean, the very odd time in Montreal, I lived there for 10 years, I would see an Indigenous person and I'd say, oh, an Indigenous person. It'd be kind of intriguing. But I lived in complete isolation from that reality. I only became aware of it when I moved to Saskatoon to be writer in residence, when the reality of the Indigenous people and their history, not only their negative history, we can't reduce them to victimhood, who they are, their wonderful sense of humor, their resilience, their very different culture, their very different way of understanding who they are, how they fit in this country. I started learning about it belatedly, shamefully, belatedly. And so Boutin was one I got, my partner and I, we got to increase our engagement, our dialogue, our attempt to understand Métis and the Indigenous peoples of Saskatchewan. So that's when we got, for a number of reasons, as I said, because of where the artist was coming from, because of that interesting mixture of sort of the figurative. You can see, obviously, it's sort of a landscape with the sky. But then there's, impositions on it of these columns of red, and then this sort of strange symbolism, iconography on top, which is quite baffling. I wasn't quite aware of any meaning that I got from reading about it. The title is Rising Awakening. Now, there's a vague sense of upward direction. You know, at the top there's a triangle, could be an arrow. So clearly the title, you know, sometimes the title of artworks, you know, sometimes they're just labeled, you know, artwork number 7. You know, that basically this has no title, it's all up to you. This one, Rising Awakening, we get a sense of just that, of rising, upward look, awakening of the spirit, of the soul. So this one was one of my Alice and I's attempt to understand the history here that I had not been aware of until now. So this is more of a historical approach to my attempt to dialogue with the Saskatchewan. The other one, the Ken Dalgarno, is just a landscape. Now, to reference Rothko again, I'll be the only one in this, I think I'm the only one in this province who never complains about the weather. I love Saskatchewan weather. Bring it on when it's -40, because it's a dry cold and it's sunny, and I love the land. I never complain about the flatness. I love that flatness. To me, it's like you see that, you know, it's very well that I simply say land of living skies, because it really is. The skies here blow me away. I was never, you know, when you live in a big city, you don't live with the weather. The weather's at most a little disturbance when you go from one house to a building, to a subway, to a car. It's just a background thing. When you move to Saskatchewan, because of these big skies, because it's an agricultural province, you live with the land. And so it's in moving to Saskatchewan that I became intoxicated with this beautiful landscapes, which are so subtle. Now I find mountains completely boring. When you go to BC, yes, the mountains initially are very impressive, but then they just block your view, and they're obviously impressive. It's like a Hollywood special effect. There's something about the Canadian prairies, that vastness that's very subtle. It's like a Rothko. You have to immerse yourself into it. The light is subtle. The coloration is subtle. So the Ken Dalgarno I like because it spoke to Saskatchewan in its geography, not so much its history, although there's a farm there. There's a barn that's collapsing that does speak of its history. But to me, what I love about this was its materiality. The painting is very thickly put on. To me, this spoke of Saskatchewan as a geography that was new to me, that I find really beautiful. The skies, the vastness of the land, the fact that you can see the curve of the planet makes me feel like a very, very small God. And so this speaks to me of where I am now. And so even though I'm in Saskatchewan, you still need to be reminded sometimes. And this painting, I have another one by Ken. Just below the Bhutan, in fact. Can you just flick to that one? See, there's another one. There you see the paint more. It just makes me feel this is Saskatchewan visually for me. This is what, I didn't expect to love so much. So this is art speaking to me geographically. And so the two of them, the Bhutan, the cut hand, or the four of them, and the two Dalgarnos, are my two ways of trying to understand this place and how I relate to it, in positive and negative ways.
Well, you were talking about, the sky here. You can see that in Michelle's piece so greatly. And I love the overlay that he's put.
Absolutely.
Kind of, inscribing on the land something new, something a little bit different than what has come before us. Yeah, really beautiful pieces.
See, once again, the ambiguity speaks to me there of what are these symbols? There's arrows in various places. What is it saying here? Like, there's a little circle with the cross. Is that like the male symbol, and the other one, or the female? What are these symbols for? But I don't need to know an answer, because I can always add ones and wonder. And so I said, it leads me to dialogue with it.
And it sounds like you're going to have a lot more dialogues with this piece moving ahead too. It sounds like it'll piece that'll be wonderful for you to continue to engage with in your collection, which is fantastic. I'm going to go quickly back to this beautiful Christy Belcourt that Tarah owns, because I would be remiss if we didn't focus on this. Christy Belcourt is really amazing artist of Métis origin, who's just continuing to grow and grow with her artwork. You can just look at the intricacy here of her work, but it's also talking, as Yann mentioned earlier, kind of looking back to traditional methods of practicing artwork, but exploding it on a level that we haven't seen before. Do you want to talk about this piece for a little bit, Tarah?
Sure, yeah. So I purchased this piece from Christy's studio during a sale that they were having. And it didn't cost very much, but it took me some time to get together the money. And by the time I went to actually purchase it, it was the last one left. But I was very lucky because I actually got the artist proof. So I was rewarded for procrastinating, I guess. I was very fortunate to have an opportunity to work with Christy on a multi-year sort of touring exhibition that I co-organized with Maria Hupfield and Tanya Willard called #CallResponse. And that project responded to the discourse around reconciliation and wanted to sort of flip that discourse as one that largely centers relationships between Indigenous people and the state, or between Indigenous and settlers in this kind of like simplistic dichotomy, by looking at the sort of radical presence and knowledge of Indigenous women. And so like I approached the project by inviting two women artists, Tanya Willard and Maria Hupfield, who I greatly admire and whose practices move in very different directions, and who, you know, I wanted to learn from at the same time as working alongside. And that sort of intention extended into the invitation to the other artists, which included Christy and Cheryl Arundel and Ursula Johnson. And as soon as we invited Christy, she further opened up the project up to her collaborator, Isaac Murdoch. And Christy's contribution to that project was deeply meaningful and speaks very powerfully, as she always does, to the idea that as Indigenous people, we need to reconcile ourselves with the land before we are ready to reconcile with one another. And, you know, sort of builds on the work that she's been doing for a number of years with her culture and language camp, which is based in Ontario. So she's currently working on some really large scale paintings in this style, but, you know, as an artist, she has consistently used her platform to talk about how we need to really do better in our relationship with the land and waters, and that we need to defend them. And so that is a sort of one way that my relationship with this work is informed. But, you know, in another context, it is like just this completely joyful, abundant, exuberant work that honors the beauty of the natural world. And like, I think I purchased this during the early days of the pandemic when I was in shock still, you know, and like was feeling this sort of surreal existential dread and uncertainty about the future. And I sort of tried to address that by taking walks around my neighborhood in Vancouver, and ended up like taking obsessive numbers of pictures of the flowers that were blossoming in the spring, and watching the hummingbirds that would come and visit the garden where we were living. And so just that was the way that I was able to find solace at that time. And I think that this is a work that that really holds that kind of feeling for me. And
brings you the joy that it's titled about.
Yeah,
You're
exactly.
looking for joy. And you
I
were
feel
saying,
like
because
sorry.
no, that's okay. This piece is actually hanging right behind you here. And you said it
Yeah.
was the first piece that you put up in your home, now that you have walls around you and not a trailer. How did it feel just putting that piece up in your personal space? Did it give you a real sense of a belonging, of home, of I could see it also maybe would give you that sense of what's yet to come, you know, being part of the Métis Nation and having this strong Métis artist setting it up on your wall. It kind of gives you, I think, a bit of a foundation and a reminder of where you've come from and where you're going to.
That's well said. I think, you know, I quickly felt very grounded when I first moved here. I think it is because of the river, because I grew up along a river, and you know, like the ocean and the mountains are beautiful and whatever, but it's a different kind of the familiarity of that landscape that you're from. You know, that does something to you. So I feel, you know, I'm very aware that I am like on the one hand a newcomer to this community, but certainly coming home to the traditional territories of my nation also feels like a homecoming. So
that's wonderful. That's great. All right, Marie, I'm going to jump back quickly to you. And what are we going to talk about? Let's talk about this piece. I'm so interested in this piece because it's got your name on it, and it sounds like a tragedy, but it's very engaging and interesting. So I'd like to know the story behind this one, Marie.
I was invited in 2018 to participate in a residency in China at Taohuatan, and there were 10 artists from across Canada who were invited to this. And John Will, who is the artist who painted this painting, was also one of the invited artists. And I met him for the very first time, actually in the Vancouver Art Gallery, not the Vancouver Airport, sorry. And then we flew to China together, and it was a 2-week residency. John is one of Canada's really important artists. He is 85 years old, maybe he's 86 now. So he has sustained a very long career as a painter, as an artist in Canada, and I don't think he's gotten the recognition that he deserves. Just a very avant-garde. He did videos that are just the most amazing things. Anyway, so here's this 85-year-old guy. And I mean, honestly, the minute I met him, I just fell in love with him. And Danny joined me in China a week into the residency, and he got on with John like a house on fire as well. So one of the things that happens in residencies is that you have very sort of intimate connections with other artists. John was painting in a separate studio from where I was, and we got materials given to us there, but he had run out of blue and he was desperate for blue. So I happened to have a bottle of blue paint, and I simply gave it to him and said, well, use this. So he took it back into his studio and painted away. And a few days later, there was an easel that was inside my studio space with a shroud over top of a canvas that was on the easel. He pulled it off, and this is what he had done. He had painted a piece for me. And honestly, it's hard to describe how meaningful that moment was, where you have connections with people that you're working with fellow artists, who present you with things that they've done in your honor, simply because I had loaned him some blue. And he's a very self-effacing kind of guy, and you know, everything he does is not worthy and whatever, but you know, honestly, the gesture of kindness in painting me this particular painting and gifting it to me, I'll just never forget. And you know, I have enormous respect for this artist, and so that even makes it more special, coming from him in such a lovely, generous kind of a way, completely unexpected. I'm very interested to put together an exhibition of his work at 330G, and in fact, I invited him to put up a show of his work in May, but then the pandemic hit in sort of February, March, And so we've had to postpone it, and John's health is compromised, so it's not like he can really move around very easily until the dust has settled with COVID. So I really hope that in the future I will be able to put up an exhibition of his work in my project space. And, you know, Danny and I have kept in touch with him. I mean, we just made a very, very deep personal connection with this man in a very sort of unusual place. And so this painting hangs in a prominent spot in our home, and it reminds us of John all the time, you know, and just that interconnectivity between artists and the kindness between people.
I love that. The community,
just,
the community
you know,
that you create among artists, especially like you mentioned in residencies, you know, you're often there for a short time. So those connections you make get deep very quickly.
also, I would just,
Yeah,
one
go ahead.
last thing, I would just say he's 85 years old and he's just a wealth of knowledge. And that's really also something that is very important and meaningful to both my husband and myself. And so we listen to him tell stories, you know, well into the night, many nights while we were in China. And, you know, those also will stay with us for a long time.
Absolutely. That's really beautiful. So when you are able to have the exhibition at 330G, will this piece be included in the exhibition of his work?
I certainly could put it in there. I'll have to ask John. We'll see what he says.
Yeah, see what he thinks.
I'll ask him.
Yeah, the story around it and the engagement, it would just be a beautiful set off to an exhibition like that. We could talk more and more, and I know I didn't cover on all the questions. One thing quickly that I want to ask each of you is, out of the works that we've looked at in your homes, and thank you again for sharing these, what do you see moving ahead as you deepen your collection and widen it for various reasons? Is there certain themes that you see coming up when you look in your collection and look around your home that, you know, you may not realize at first, but then you look and you're like, wow, I'm really into this, or this just seems to keep popping up without any intention. So I'm going to start with Yann. Have you ever noticed anything like that in your collection as you've been traveling the world and collecting over the years, you and your wife together? Are there certain themes or issues that come up that seem to be resonating in the work that you want to surround yourself with in your home, in your private space?
No, not really, because first of all, I'm not acquisitive by nature. I love art. I live and breathe art in all its forms, but I don't particularly want to own it because that makes me slightly uncomfortable. I'd much rather share it with everyone. So I don't usually think in terms of, oh, I want this in my house. And so I'm open to everything that I see, and I you know, if I don't like it, I'll still engage with it. I'll still dialogue with it. So not really. I'm not looking to have too many things. I bought a few, as I said, that I've discussed here, in part because I want to live where I live, and art will help me do that. And so the cut hand, the Dalgarno, help me do that, and then the Mayo is sort of like a touchstone. But so no, I think, I mean, who knows? You know, if I see something next week that I really like, maybe we'll get it. But I'm not looking, in that sense, I'm not really a collector. I'm a lover, but I'm not necessarily a collector. So I'm not looking to expand it. I mean, Marie was describing very beautifully her relationship with art between her and her husband, how they exchange, and you know, that's a different, I can see a visual artist, the way I have books in my house, I can see how a visual artist would have artwork in the house.
Yeah.
Mine is, I said, is less, not that Marie's acquisitive at all, I didn't mean to say that, but mine is more just, I will travel through this land and see it, but I won't necessarily take it with me. Yeah,
you take it as it comes and absorbs it at the time. Yeah. Tarah, what about yourself?
Yeah, I don't have a master plan by any means. I visited Vancouver a couple of weeks ago, and I almost bid on a painting that the Burn Arts Foundation's fundraiser. So, you know, it was a kind of a confluence of circumstances that bring new artworks into your life. So
Absolutely.
so you know, like the Carl beam I bought from an auction house because I couldn't believe the price that Carl Beam's prints sell for. Like it's ridiculous for like the father of Indigenous contemporary art. For me to be able to afford to purchase his work, I was just like, oh yeah, like I'm gonna do that. I need to do that.
Absolutely, really important artist to have. One of the first people, I think, to really do what is called in art history and other places is kind of talking back to his experience, his lived life, and these images that really don't represent who he is as a person. But how he was represented, not by his choice at all. So yeah, I love the work of Carl Beam as well. That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Marie, let's just talk over to you too. Any between you and Danny, like you said, you kind of go back and forth buying gifts for each other, having that idea of what each other kind of likes to collect. Have you seen any kind of similarity or a certain theme that's come up through your artwork, through your years of collecting? Not intentionally, but just something that you've kind of, hey, that's interesting, because we're not always fully conscious of that until we can step back from it and see what we've collected, what we have in our homes.
Actually, I would say it's more what we're drawn to, and that is a variety. I mean, our collection is very eclectic. So I don't know that there are necessarily themes that we go to or think about when we are purchasing work. And I love having a lot of work around, and if we can afford things, I love buying it because I think it's extremely important to support other artists' work. And the other benefit that I have as a visual artist and as a practicing artist is that I'm able to trade with a lot of artists. And so our collection has definitely grown as a result of that. So, you know, that's just a great relationship to have with another artist, where you can be in, you know, surrounded by their work, but your work actually goes to them at the same time. And so there is kind of a nice reciprocity and a shared appreciation of each other's practice. And that does a lot in terms of building confidence and, you know, alongside building a collection. We've got sculpture, we've got paintings, we have carvings. I have a paddle in the room that I'm sitting in behind me. My husband was the chief adjudicator of the Indian Residential School Secretariat, and that's definitely informed a lot of our purchases. There was a large tondo on our fireplace by a Tsimshian artist who was one of the very few apprentices to Robert Davidson, the Haida artist. So, you know, it's important that we have work that has related to our work around us in whatever form that might take, you know? So, I mean, John's painting that I showed you, well, that was a gift, but it was blue. Blue happens to be one of the colors that I'm extremely fond of and have worked a lot with, you know? So that's a tie-in with John's piece. This work definitely speaks to Danny's interest in the work that he's been involved with for a number of years. And again, you know, our interests in life expand. We're curious about a lot of different things and engaged in a lot of different areas. And so if these can be mementos or commemorative things to remind us of work that we've done, places that we've visited, people we've met, that's an important component to our collection. And the other thing I would say is we have a lot of work. We have 2 kids and we will pass this on to them. A lot of the trades that I've done with kids and my peers, I mean, the point of doing a lot of that is that in the future, I'd like to donate this body of work that represents people who I worked with throughout my career here to a museum. Hopefully there will be a museum who would be willing to take this on, but you know, that's a way also of passing on work that we have lived with and pieces that have been meaningful to us and to me in particular, to a larger place and putting it into a larger context for other people to enjoy and experience.
I
So
love
that's
that.
definitely part
I
of the
love that. That is so wonderful because that speaks to what Yann was saying about how he's kind of uncomfortable having it, like secreting it away in his home, and would like to have it more in a public space to be seen. And that's the last question that we're going to have to try to do as quickly as possible here, is just talking about the difference between having artwork in your home and having it displayed publicly. I love public art. I'm all for it. I think we need more of it, especially, you know, in Saskatchewan. There's a lot of kind of memorials, but a little more engagement, I think, with Indigenous artists and the land is important in our community. So I'm all about public art. How do you feel about it, Tarah, as far as kind of playing off of what Marie just said? She has this collection and she'd like to share it with the world moving ahead. As a curator, what do you see the value is between shared art that we share in our community, not just what we have residing in our homes?
I think I'm obviously deeply invested in that. You know, I think my hopes for museums is for them to be civic spaces that the community feels itself represented by and in, and that they have a stake in and feel, you know, engaged by and spoken to directly. And you know, I see the like art in public as in a continuum with that. And you know, I think coming from Vancouver, where the city of Vancouver, you know, in 2014 sort of declared the year of reconciliation, and then acknowledged that it was on unceded territories sort of formally, which both of these kinds of like symbolic gestures led to some really interesting programs that were driven by the host nation communities in Vancouver to do certain kinds of public art projects, particularly around Stanley Park and other sites that have real significance in the community. And then they also have a public art program, which I think is so great, which is an artist-driven public art call. So artists can, you know, put forward gestures of a wide variety that happen in public space as part of the public art program. And so rather than, you know, the call being driven by a specific, as you say, you know, like a kind of memorial or in relation to development, has allowed some really, really engaging pieces to come forward. And, you know, I'm so new that I don't know a lot about the public art program here in Saskatoon yet, but I would love to see something like that happen.
Awesome. All right, Yann, I want to hear your feelings about public art. I kind of have an idea of where you're going to go already, because I can see you're passionate about that, and the sharing of work with others is so important. So just want to hear what you have to say about your feelings towards public art as opposed to art that you would have privately and collect in your home.
Well, I mean, what's wonderful about art is talking about it. It's obviously a private experience, but it's really nice to share it. And you can talk about a book because it's very easy to get a book. Books are relatively cheap. You can get in public libraries. It's easy for everyone to access a book. Books are very much public works of art. You know, one of the odd limitations of visual art is you know, unless you're Andy Warhol and you make many copies of it, or Dali, you know, these things come, there's only one of them. You can do prints, I suppose, but still they're fairly limited. So the access is fairly limited. You can see, you know, facsimiles of it, pictures and all that, but the thing itself, there's very few. So if it's owned, if it's in private hands, it limits who can see it, therefore it limits the dialogue of art. You know, if famous art was only in the hands of billionaires, it would die. It's being shared by the majority that it becomes a vital force, not only in terms of dialogue, but in terms of us understanding who we are. So I love public art. I love museums. I love galleries. I'm a big fan of the Ramey. I remember, well, it's too long to tell, a shocking experience once in Montreal where I had to hire a lawyer for $300 to save $300. I didn't know he'd cost me that much. I had a dispute with Revenue Canada. So I went to the Shark's office on the 40th floor of some high rise in Montreal. I had no money and I want to try to save $300. And the lawyer cost me $300. And he, as I said, he was a shark and said, well, let's do it. You know, he told me what he'd charge me. I said, oh, okay, well, I guess whatever. But don't worry, I'll win and it'll be less than an hour. So whatever, you'll get nothing, but you'll have won. So whatever. So he said, well, we'll do this in the boardroom. And in the boardroom where we were doing this case, where he called, this was before the, you know, computers, this is on a phone. In this boardroom, there were these 8 Cornelius Krieghoff. And Cornelius Krieghoff was this 19th century painter who did these, by our standards now, sort of sentimental, slightly kitschy paintings of habitant life. But they're still quite beautiful. They're vivid. And there was 8 of these original Krieghoffs on the wall. So I was kind of blown away. And I'm saying, who's going to see these? There's this shark of a human being, of a lawyer, who told me very clearly, you know, you got to pay me this. I wouldn't help my sister. And I was thinking, yeah, I bet you wouldn't help your sister. Here was this shark, you know, in this boardroom surrounded by these Cornelius Krieghoffs that no one would see, except poor suckers like me brought in because they need a lawyer, or this man. And so this is art that, in a sense, you know, dies being brought out of the water and dies on the beach because it's not seen by people. So I very much believe in public art, because that's how art lives. Art is like a fish. It needs to circulate. It needs to travel through waters to live. So I have no problem with private ownership too, because after all, I don't live in a shell. People come to my home. In fact, you know what, if there's ever a Ruth Cuthand show, I'd be very happy to share my Cuthand. So, but you know, if it's to be had by, you know, I remember when I was a university student, they would have, I'm sure they still have these, they'd have these traveling sale shows of reproductions. So you can have them as posters. They cost nothing, $20. You'd get a Rothko if you wanted. That kind of public art I like, because that's very cheap. Everyone can have it. It's disposable. You can access it quickly. It still goes on your wall. It's a very accessible form of art. You know, as I said, I believe the more it circulates, the more people can see it, the more art becomes alive.
Absolutely. And I really love what Marie said about wanting to pass on this collection that her and Danny have created, and giving it to a public space where it can be seen and enjoyed. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for your time with this. I'm sorry to have kept you much, much longer than we intended, but I think it was a great conversation. I know there were some areas we wanted to tap into that we didn't, but I think what was said tonight and what we've been discussing is really wonderful. And I hope people take a lot away from this, not just what you 3 have presented as far as your personal collections, but also what you presented us about how you live with art and how you connect with it, and what that means to you. So homework for everybody watching: Ruth Cuthand, check her out. Don't forget about the Regina 5, very, very important. And go visit the new show at the Remy. And we also have with Art Now, we have more programming coming up starting tomorrow. So make sure you tune in, register for the upcoming events at Art Now. And I thank you all for joining us this evening. Sorry for taking up so much of your time, but it was a great conversation, and I look forward to connecting with you all again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly.
All right, take care, everybody.
Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.